now we'll assume they're fixed, I can rewrite this as wage times the change in labor over the change in quantity. And now I can write this as wage times the change in labor over the change in quantity. Now if I stood on my head like that, and I looked at that last expression, have I seen this expression before? I haven't seen this expression, but I've seen the inverse. What's the change in quantity due to a change in input, or change in quantity due to a change in labor? Yes. Oh, close. Starts with marginal. Starts with marginal. You got half the answer right. So change in output, if I had one more unit of labor, how much does output change? Marginal product of labor is what it is, right? So this here is marginal rate of technical substitution is change in K over change in L, all right? Two changes too. But this here is change in output due to a change in labor, but we flipped it. So this here is the inverse of the marginal product of labor, right? So marginal cost is simply wage over the marginal product of labor. Let's check that for a second, right? Let's assume wage is $1, right? So do away with weird wages. So if wage is $1, marginal cost is inversely proportional to the marginal product of labor. So if you have really, really productive labor that you're hiring, what happens to your marginal costs? They're lower, right? If you're hiring your cousin, who we all know is a slacker, what happens to your marginal costs? You get low marginal product of labor and your costs go up, right? So marginal costs are inversely related to the marginal product of labor. Now I'm so excited about this. Let's take this one step further. So that's marginal product of labor and marginal cost. So if we look at our picture here, this is my marginal product of labor curve. That looks almost exactly like the inverse, the flip of the marginal cost curve. There's a mapping here. It's not 1 for 1 because it's wage over the marginal product of labor, which takes care of these units here. But generally given this shape here is some inverse transformation of the marginal product of labor. How about average product of labor and average variable cost? Well, I'm glad you asked. Change color. Average variable cost is simply total variable cost over quantity. Total variable cost is wage times labor over quantity. And again, if you stand on your head and you look at that last expression here, if we take the inverse of this, it's output per unit of labor. Output per unit of labor is the average product of labor, right? So average variable cost is equal to wage over the average product of labor. So if you have very productive labor, right, your average variable costs are going to be low. If you have slacker labor, your average variable costs are going to be relatively high. So there's again this inverse relationship between average variable cost and average product of labor and marginal cost and marginal product of labor. Now again, if you look at the average product of labor curve right here, it looks a lot like my average variable cost curve. This one right here, just flipped and rescaled by wage. Now here comes the kicker. Are you ready for it? What's the most interesting point in economics always? It's where the lines cross, or our tangents, right? What happens here? Well, at this point right here, average product is equal to marginal product, right? So at point A, right here, average product of labor equals the marginal product of labor. How do I show this? Yeah. Give me 1 second here. That's at A. Let's look at point B. Oh, that's smart. Okay. Let's look at point B. Point B is going to be this point right here. It's a performance art piece where I have you go back and forth on your pages. It makes this nice noise in the classroom. Okay, so point B here, where average variable cost is equal to marginal cost. So at B, marginal cost equals average variable cost. Well, I know marginal cost is wage over marginal product of labor is equal to wage over the average product of labor. Are you ready for it? Cross these because these cancel and flip it. So at B, marginal product of labor is equal to the average product of labor. No way, Max. No way. So the output level at B here is exactly the output level at which you use the amount of labor where average product is equal to marginal product. Oh, wow, right? So the output level right here at B is the point where average product of labor is equal to marginal product of labor, is that point right here. At quantities greater than that, right, marginal cost is greater than average variable cost, and marginal product is lower than average product. At quantities less than B, average product is less than marginal product, and average variable cost is greater than marginal cost. But this point B and this point A are the same point, right? So where marginal cost crosses average variable cost at its minimum is exactly the point where marginal product of labor is equal to the average product of labor. It's the same on quantity. So the correct way to say this, right, and I tried to get this across a second ago, but as I was saying it, I was going too fast, right? This here is the output level, right? That is the output level that requires this amount of labor right here at the crossing point, because we have labor on the x-axis here and we have quantity right here. But the firm, if it were producing at that output level, if it had a spreadsheet that showed its average and marginal product of labor, at this output level, it would be exactly at this point right here, right? But we're drawing in different dimensions. Was that the answer to your question? Yes, so we've got to assume that wage is constant. So if you're in a scenario where as we scale up production, in the short run, wages go up. For example, you go from a 40-hour work week to a 60-hour work week, and with a 60-hour work week, all of a sudden wages go up, then you've got troubles here, right? So we're assuming wage is constant, and we can modify this, but this only holds if wage is constant. Good question. All right, so that's that. That was not a really quick drawing lesson. That was like a 40-minute drawing lesson, but a good one. So we got that. So that's it for the short run, really. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the long run. The long run's pretty exciting. And create some complications, but we have to think about it, right? Because firms don't just plan on what to produce with a given level of capital. Starbucks certainly thinks about how many stores it should have in the Berkeley area and how many espresso machines there should be in each individual store. So we're shifting into a world now where we worry about actually adjusting all of your inputs, right? Nothing's fixed anymore. Everything's variable. You can adjust labor and capital at will. So this, of course, also means that since there are no fixed inputs in the long run, all your costs are variable, right? So now both labor and capital are variable costs, versus in the short run, only labor was variable because you couldn't adjust capital. So there are no more fixed costs. There's no longer this distinction between fixed costs and variable costs. Everything's variable costs in the long run. So LRTC equals LRVC simply means the long run total cost curve is equal to the long run variable cost curve because there are no fixed costs in the long run. Now what do you have to do? Right? In the short run, you would have to choose the optimal amount of labor to produce whatever output you want to produce. in the long run, you've got a more complicated set of problems because you don't only choose how much labor you don't only choose the amount of labor given a certain amount of capital, but you've got to adjust your input mix. You've got to choose both capital and labor in order to produce your output in a way that ultimately maximizes profits or minimizes costs. So what you're going to do is you're going to choose a combination of labor and capital, right, which we call here an input mix or combination of inputs, but from all technologically efficient combinations of inputs, right? No waste of inputs here. There's no slack labor or capital sitting around. But you've got to figure out what is the combination of labor and capital that is economically efficient, right? And by economically efficient, we're ultimately going to mean the one that's going to help us maximize profit, but we'll see that in a second. But the big insight here is now you no longer just choose one input, you choose two. You're not stuck with one espresso machine. You could have 17 if you wanted to. So in order to help us work this out, what we're going to have to deal with is something called an iso cost line, right? We're going to go back to our humanistic education, and we are going to go back to ancient Greece and realize that the word iso means same, and cost is Greek for cost. I'm joking. No, same cost lines is what an iso cost line is going to be. So it's going to be a line that lives in labor and capital space that shows me all the combinations of inputs that cost the same dollar amount, right? So we're going to have a price of labor, which is our hourly wage. We're going to have a price of capital, which is our rental rate. And there is a major mistake on this slide. -5 points max. Plus, that's a plus, not a star. So it's all combinations of inputs that require the same total expenditure or cost. If total cost is hourly wage times number of workers hired per hour, plus rental rate times the number of units of capital used, that's total cost. And the ISO cost tells me if I had $100 to spend on labor and capital, what combinations of labor and capital can I afford for those $100? This is very similar to this budget constraint notion where if you had $100 of income to spend on Reese's and Hershey's, how many Reese's or what bundles of Reese's and Hershey's could you choose? Only now we're in a labor and capital instead of a Reese's and Hershey's world. So the easiest way to think about this is as follows. Think about a world where the rental rate of capital is about $10, not is about. Is exactly $10. This is science. Is exactly $10 per unit. The wage per hour is $5 per hour. And then I want to know what bundles of labor and capital can I, as the firm, afford if I had $50, $100, or $150. Right? So the way to figure this out is as follows. Darn it. The scale on this thing is busted. Okay, so this should be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30. Okay? So this is labor. So let's start with the big spender one. If I had $150 to spend, capital costs $10 a unit. If I spent all my money on capital, I could afford 15 units. If I spent all my money on labor, labor costs $5 a unit, I have $150, I could afford 30 units, or anything in between. So my ISO cost line looks like this, okay? This is my ISO cost for 150. The intercept here, bless you, is 150 divided by 10, and down here, it's 150 divided by 5. Now if my total cost was 100, $10 per unit of capital, I could buy 10 units, $5 per unit of labor, I could buy 20 units. So I can again draw, here we go, my ISO cost curve for $100. And in yet another snoozy act, Max is going to draw the total cost curve, or the ISO cost curve for a total cost of $50. You could afford 5, capital, 10 labor, or anything in between. Okay, so this is the ISO cost for 50. So what we're seeing here already, visually, and we will convince ourselves of that in a second, is the more money I'm willing to spend, or I get to spend, and we still have to figure out how to make that decision, the more money I get to spend, the further out the ISO cost line goes, and these things look parallel, right? I'm just shifting them out parallel. So this looks really similar to when we did Engel curves, where for a given price of Hershey's and Reese's, we ramped up income and the budget constraint shifted out parallel, right? So this is exactly what you do with an ISO cost curve. Lines further out have higher total cost expenditures. So let's look at this for 1 second here and think about what this curve actually looks like. So my total cost is wage times L plus R times K. This is a K here. So what I'm drawing on the y-axis here is K, so I'm going to solve my ISO cost equation for K and see what I get. So we would get total cost minus W times L equals R times K, or K is equal to total cost over R minus W over R times L. So this here is going to be my intercept on the y-axis, and this here is going to be the slope. Okay, so if I draw this line, my ISO cost curve, I have K on the y-axis, right? The intercept on the y-axis is total cost divided by R. So if I have $100 to spend, if I want to know how many units of capital I can buy, I divide it by the cost per unit of capital, so that makes sense, right? 150 divided by 10 should get you 15 units. And the slope of the ISO cost line is minus W over R. What was the slope of the budget constraint? Anybody remember? That was midterm 1 max, all erased from brain. It was minus the price of Hershey's over the price of Reese's, right? So it was minus the price of the good on the x-axis over the price of the good on the y-axis. So here, we've got minus the price of the input on the x-axis, labor, wage, over the price of the input on the y-axis, which is capital, right? So minus W over R is the rate at which the market will let you transform capital into more labor, much like the budget constraint let you transform Reese's into Hershey's at a rate that's proportional to the prices of those two goods. So very similar concept, only what we're actually dealing with now is not Reese's, Hershey's, and income, but we're dealing with total costs, labor, and capital. But in terms of graphically moving these things around, it looks exactly the same. So for a second, we go back to our graph here, right? The intercept here is total cost 2 divided by R, and the slope of the ISO cost line is minus W over R. That's snoozy. I'm getting some loud yawns today. Maybe you guys are just exhausted from midterms. Okay? So that's the slope of the ISO cost curve. So you're sitting there probably thinking still, yeah, I'm getting all these concepts, but why are we doing all this? What I still haven't told you yet is what the firm wants to do ultimately, right? We know that the firm wants to maximize profit, but in order to maximize profits, the firm's going to have to choose how much to produce. So it takes a really long time to get there, right? I still haven't answered that question for you yet. So in about a lecture or so, we'll get there and we'll have a great answer for how much the firm wants to produce. But before we get there, we need to figure out if the firm knew what it wants to produce, how does it choose the optimal input combination? So that's what we're building up first, and then the next step will be, well, how do I figure out how much I want to produce, okay? Just in case you're a little bit lost on the path. So these are my isocost lines. They're kind of cute, they're nice and linear, easy to draw, and related closely to, there we go, to the budget constraint that we saw before. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to figure out, if I know that I want to produce 100 units of output, how do I graphically figure out what the least cost combination of inputs is that I should use in order to produce those 100 units of output? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine two pieces of information. I'm going to combine what I know what I can do technologically, meaning all the possible input combinations I can use that produce 100 units of output. So I'm going to use that isoquant for 100 units. And I'm going to use the cost information, namely isocost lines, that build in the given prices of wage, of labor and capital, namely wage and rental rate of capital. And I'm going to combine those two in order to pick one spot on the isoquant that tells me the least cost combination of labor and capital in order to produce 100 units of output. This is pretty awesome. So why don't you want to produce the highest cost way of producing 100 units of output? I don't think that's even worth discussing, right? Because you could put the resources to better use and do something else with it. This is in some sense the point of environmental economics. We're trying to save the world at least cost, right? There's lots of people trying to save the world, but we try and do this at least cost. So we're not very successful at it yet, but give us another 100 years. So the point here is you're trying to produce 100 units of output at least cost, namely pick the combination of labor and capital that minimizes the cost of producing 100 units. Let's minimize some costs. Yeah, that seems like a really exciting call to arms, right? Yay, accountants everywhere rejoicing. So this is capital and labor right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the isoquant for 100 units. So my isoquant, I'm going to assume that this is a firm that has a Cobb-Douglas production function, and I know this firm well. This is Max Alfhammer's Lentil Stew Shop, or whatever you want to call it. This is what my isoquant looks like. Any combination of labor and capital on this isoquant produces 100 pints of lentil stew, okay? That seems very unappealing. But ice cream put me in the hospital, so let's pick something else. What's something delicious? Chocolate, of course. Max's Chocolate Factory. So 100 great chocolate bars right here. He's got labor and capital he could use to produce them, and I know that that's what my isoquant is here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hire a Stanford accountant, and the Stanford accountant draws the following isocost line, okay? He says, well, in my class, I saw that this is my isocost line for $200, right? So he looks at what wage and what the rental rate of capital is. He looks at his isocost line and draws this one and says anything on this isocost line here costs $200, and you would minimize the lowest cost you can spend in order to produce 100 units is $200. For which I say, nonsense, right? Even a person that got 60 out of 100 on this last midterm would know that that's no way that that's least cost, right? We're going to draw an isocost line that looks something like this. And there's one point right here on this isocost line that shares my 100 unit isoquant right here. Wow, this is the most beautiful tangency I've drawn in 10 years. Look at that thing. Whoa! That is amazing. Okay, but we argue that even if you nudge this isocost line in a little bit, you'd lose a shared point with the isoquant, right? So the lowest isocost line I can get on and still share a point with my 100 unit isoquant is, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers here, right? This isocost is $160, okay? So this combination of labor and capital right here, L star, a little bit above 5, and K star, a little bit above 6, that is my cost minimizing combination of capital and labor to produce 100 units. Given current technology and management ability and insights and economic genius, you cannot produce 100 units at a lower cost than $160. So what's true with this? What does this picture really look like? You've seen this exact same picture, just with different labels. Everything comes back to Reese's and Hershey's, right? So when we looked at an individual and said they had they regarded Reese's and Hershey's as imperfect substitutes, and we tried to maximize utility subject to a budget constraint, we saw a picture just like this, right? Where the indifference curve was tangent to the budget constraints, and that was the highest indifference curve the individual could get on, given the scarcity they face in the shape of income and prices. Here, it's slightly different in the sense that we pick output, right? And we minimize costs. Instead of trying to get on the highest isoquant subject to a certain cost, we're trying to hit a certain isoquant by getting on the lowest isocost line, but the ultimate outcome looks really similar, right? In consumer choice, at that point, the marginal rate of substitution was equal to the price ratio of Reese's and Hershey's. What's true here? Well, here again, the isoquant is tangent to the isocost line. What's the slope of the isoquant? Now you get to say it. A winner. All right, that's the marginal rate of technical substitution is the slope of the isoquant, right? That's going to be equal to the slope of the isocost line, which I told you about 10 minutes ago is the ratio of wage over the rental rate of capital. So again, very similar concept, right? Almost the exact same piece of insight here. Now, instead of having the marginal rate of substitution being equal to the ratio of prices, what we've got here now is the ratio of input prices, wage over rental rate of capital, being equal to the marginal rate of technical substitution at this point of tangency. Don't worry, we will play with this when we'll talk about Leontief production, we'll talk about linear production, all kinds of things, but it's most nicely seen in this imperfect substitutes or Cobb-Douglas type setting. So if your isoquants are smooth, and when I say your isoquants are smooth, that means Cobb-Douglas.